Thank you, Matt. And now we see the results of some of the largesse of the Decorative Arts Trust. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'm going to go off track just a bit to say that his Instagram account is maybe the most beautiful and informative I've encountered in the decorative arts. It's so much fun to follow him. Now, those of you who do not know what Instagram is, it's not just about Kim Kardashian taking selfies. Virtually all of the organizations represented in the Decorative Arts Trust have Instagram accounts. It's a wonderful way to stay in touch. The Decorative Arts Trust has a beautiful one, and many of our speakers do. I've learned so much on Philippe's. Ralph Harvard's is a virtual lesson in Virginia architecture and far beyond. It's a very useful tool. So if you don't have a grandchild, rent a 3-year-old. They will tell you how to get connected. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce our John A.H. Sweeney Emerging Scholar Lecturer, Philippe Halbert. Philippe is a PhD candidate in the Department of the History of Art at Yale. He's a graduate of the College of William and Mary and the Winter Tour program in American Material Culture, and as mentioned, a doctoral candidate in art history at Yale. Committed to the museum field and publishing engagement in the humanities, he's held positions at institutions including the Louvre, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the J. Paul Getty Museum, and the Yale University Art Gallery. He is also a contributing editor at The Junto, a group blog on early American history. He's presently at work on his dissertation, tentatively entitled Louisiana Purchases, get it? Buying Respectability and Fashioning Identity in the Colonial Gulf South. And his presentation today is drawn from that ongoing project. He has coached me in pronunciation of his lecture title. I remember my French master at school said, "Oh my God, you have the accent of a Marseille sailor. Nobody nice is ever going to speak to you." And so I switched to Italian at William and Mary, and apparently I have a Sicilian sailor's accent there. So at least I'm consistent. I am coastal and Southern. His lecture is Creole Comforts and French Connections, the Material World of Françoise Petit de Coulange, 1732 to 1812. All right?
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I want to reiterate my thanks to the Decorative Arts Trust, to our hosts here at the collection, and to you all for joining us for what I think has been a really fun time. I've had too much fun, and I'm not looking forward to leaving tomorrow, but got to do it. So with that said, so this is basically a case study from my dissertation. I'm looking forward to sharing a few case studies within a case study with you today. So thank you again for your time and for attending this event. In 1764, the Creole noblewoman Marie-Françoise Antoinette Petit de Coulange, let's say at one time, returned to New Orleans after a 5-year sojourn. Called Françoise by her family, she had been living in and around Paris and Versailles with 3 of her children and 4 slaves. However, as she set foot in New Orleans for the first time since leaving in 1759, Françoise found herself in a place that was no longer French. Claimed by France in 1682, French colonial Louisiana was an immense territory stretching, as you can see on this map, from the Gulf Coast to just below the Great Lakes, basically the Midwest. After 1763, Louisiana was a Spanish colony, at least on paper. Yet Françoise was not so quick to abandon her French connections in seeing by what she was coming home with, likely including her portrait, one of the treasures here at the collection, one of the earliest known portraits of a white colonist from Louisiana. Her other possessions were not so lucky. During the course of the voyage, a leak had sprung in the hold of the ship, ruining her crates, and a 2-page report enumerating the contents and the damage begins with 4 large plate glass mirrors. These were held within carved giltwood frames, probably in the Rococo style, and they were crowned with decorative landscape paintings. These are described as trumeau mirrors, meant to be placed between 2 windows, like a pier glass or over a mantelpiece. And 2 of the mirrors were 7 feet in height, the other 2 4 feet, so rather large pieces of plate glass. Next was a red Morocco leather stool with 2 broken legs, a crushed walnut table, and a marble slab for a chest of drawers smashed into 3 pieces. Last but not least was a large parrot cage, half broken. I would be mad too. Easy to overlook, this anecdote allows us to situate a place like New Orleans within a larger Atlantic world of identity, taste, and trade. This is important because many visitors to the colonial city describe New Orleans as rustic and devoid of material comfort. In 1719, one claimed that tapestries and fine beds were unknown in New Orleans. Another wrote in 1803 that, quote, people here are so ignorant of the goods that they do acquire that a beautiful marble is no better esteemed than a common stone, and no effort spent to make the distinction. It seems necessary to take these criticisms with a grain of salt, or two. As she attempted to transport lavish French furniture across the Atlantic to Louisiana in 1764, Françoise Petit de Coulange would have likely taken offense to such caustic dismissal. And part of my dissertation, again, is focused on this one French colonial woman, a central thread in a larger study of self-fashioning in New Orleans before the Louisiana Purchase. This was fun to make. Who was Françoise? She belonged to an elite network of merchants, soldiers, and statesmen with ties across the Atlantic world. Like many early settlers in Louisiana, she was of Canadian stock. Her father was a Canadian nobleman, a soldier who came to Louisiana in the 1720s. Her mother was the child of immigrants from Quebec who settled on Dauphin Island, a barrier island off the coast of what's now Alabama. And Françoise herself was born in what's now Arkansas, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Returned to New Orleans to be baptized in what is now St. Louis Cathedral in 1734, she married a Canadian cousin there at the age of 14 in 1746. Widowed a year later, she married the second highest ranking French official in Louisiana in 1749. Widowed a second time in 1757, Françoise left Louisiana for France to settle various accounts in the wake of the 7 Years' War. It was at the Church of Saint Martin in Meudon, near Paris, that she married Vmon in 1761. The couple probably knew each other as he had been posted to New Orleans and in Alabama in the 1750s. Vmon returned to Louisiana via Havana in mid-1765, joining his family in New Orleans and changing his French uniform for a Spanish one, seen here, the uniform of the Spanish Louisiana Infantry Battalion, and he died here in 1769. Françoise does not seem to have sought a fourth husband, but rather devoted herself to advancing the fortunes of her family in a changing colony. Both of her Vmon sons entered the military, with the oldest, Charles, seen here, remaining in Louisiana. Shown in the same uniform as his father, he fought the British at Baton Rouge in 1779 and served as a commandant of his mother's birthplace, the Arkansas Post, from 1794 to 1802. He lived in Arkansas for the rest of his life, dying there in the 1820s, and this sketch by a French artist shows his rather rustic home, which was still occupied by his wife in 1855. Some rather long-lived women in this family, actually. Of Françoise's 2 daughters from her second marriage, the youngest, at Wright, died in Paris from smallpox in 1764. They actually left her there because she was so sick, and she's buried in Paris. The elder daughter, Marie-Louise, was one of the many young Creole women to marry into the newly arrived Spanish corps of military officers. Her husband, Mohini, seen here, served as interim governor of Louisiana in 1800, just before his death. And Françoise lived with the couple from 1770 onwards. This daughter, Marie-Louise, lived on until 1834 and saw one of her sons become U.S. Senator in 1824. When she died here in New Orleans at the age of 80 in 1812, Françoise had lived long enough to see the Louisiana Purchase. 7 months before she was buried in St. Louis Cemetery, number 1, the Orleans Territory, which contained New Orleans, entered the Union as the 18th state. However, apart from these portraits, there are no objects belonging to or directly associated with Françoise known to survive. Close reading of archival documents and comparable objects can, however, help to fill in the blanks. Before steamboats, sugar barons, and even the Greek revival, Louisiana's elite derived wealth and power from slave-based agricultural exploitation, trade, military prowess, and political patronage. Conspicuous consumption and competition were also part of the equation, and maintaining appearances, often in excess of actual need, was both desirable and expected, with the nature and type of goods used in colonial New Orleans changing over time. I'll start from the beginning. I mentioned that Françoise was born in what's now Arkansas, where my father is actually from, so it's a small world even today. But she was born at the Arkansas Post, a remote foothold on the Arkansas River, a tributary of the Mississippi. This is really the middle of nowhere even today, so you can imagine the 18th century, it's not an easy place to get to. But Françoise's father served as the post commandant from 1731 until 1734. During this time, her father expanded the commandant's quarters, affording his family a minimum of comfort on the frontier in a 3-room house, slightly raised on wooden piers with a bark roof and gallery and cypress floors and ceilings. Françoise was almost certainly born in this house, which might have resembled the house seen here, the Ménard house, now destroyed, built near the post but at an unknown date, and similar to the Lacour house that some of us saw in Pointe-Coupée. Measuring over 7 feet in length, this buffalo hide robe provides us with the only colonial era view of the Arkansas Post. I don't know if I have a mouse on here, but yeah, it's the one house with a chimney. It's believed to have been completed by the Quapaw, allied to the French, and it made its way to Paris sometime before 1781, probably via New Orleans. The hide depicts an armed confrontation between opposing native people, along with a ceremonial calumet or peace pipe dance. It's entirely possible that this hide commemorates the reestablishment of the Arkansas Post in 1731 by Françoise's father, an event that also reaffirmed the Franco-Quapaw alliance. Indigenous people were an important part and visible component of society in early Louisiana. As post-commandant, Françoise's father had many dealings with them, and colonial alliances with native people were crucial, sometimes occasioning the creation of striking visual material. These are details from military commissions given to native warriors by French and Spanish governors of Louisiana. In addition to providing strategic support, native people often came to New Orleans to trade supplies and sell goods like baskets and pottery. Colonial accounts and inventories describe these kinds of objects in the homes of colonists to include the same kind of split river cane basket still made by the Chitimacha tribe of St. Mary Parish today, prized by collectors. We saw a great collection of these on Thursday. These are typically double woven with complex patterns in red, black, and natural yellow. And there's a quote that these just elicited such awe and admiration from European visitors who found these just striking. Although the French had native allies, indigenous nations sought favor with other powers, to include the Chickasaw, allied with the British. Françoise's father was among those taken captive, tortured, and killed by the Chickasaw in a 1736 campaign. Her mother died a few years later in 1738, leaving Françoise and her younger brother orphans in the care of their grandparents. The paper trail suggests that while her brother was sent to France for his education, Françoise remained in New Orleans to be educated by the Ursuline or Ursuline nuns. She was probably educated in the first convent, a timber frame structure completed in 1734 and replaced with the convent that now stands today on Charter Street, which survives as the oldest documented building in the Mississippi Valley. We've all seen one, if not both, of these tables on this trip, believed to have been used in the refectory of the convent, or their dining hall, basically. About 12 feet in length. They exhibit mortise and tenon joinery, and their 6 drawers are through drawers, and so I hope this is a good visual to get a sense of how that actually works, since we saw the complete piece. Combining a simple form with a useful function, these tables survive in their own way as a monument to the communal lifestyle of the extraordinary women who made use of them. Also from the sisters are a number of small walnut tables with scalloped skirts. Their cabriole legs terminate in carved hoof feet, and these are often identified in colonial inventories as pied de biche, literally deer foot or deer leg. With its unique saltier stretcher, this Louisiana table might have been used by one of the sisters or even a boarder as a nightstand. They're my favorite thing. I think these are just great. Françoise's time at the convent ended with or shortly before her 1746 marriage to a somewhat distant 46-year-old cousin in the parish church of St. Louis, now the cathedral on Jackson Square. A married woman at age 14, Françoise began her own household, and her brother's demise 4 years before also made her the sole heir to the Coulange estate. Inventoried in 1738, her parents' property included silver, linens, furniture, and 16 enslaved people of African descent. Yet the first item inventoried was actually a dressing set of black lacquer. Identified as a toilette or a toilette, this set consisted of 6 different boxes, 2 large square ones, 2 for powder, and 2 smaller patch boxes for mouche or black silk beauty spots or marks. Together with an 18-inch tall dressing glass, a brush, and a long box, this set of lacquer objects was appraised at 100 French pounds and used by Françoise's mother. The late Madame de Coulange was not the only one to own such an object. Living on an upriver plantation near what's now Kenner, where many of you will be traveling to or in and out of to leave New Orleans near the airport, her sister-in-law, Louise Malbec, owned a lacquer dressing box on a walnut stand, also in 1738. Françoise inherited her mother's toilette, specifically set aside for her, in 1746. Noting women's predilection for powders, patches, and rouge in 1728, the Ursuline sister Stanislas commented that the devil had a great empire in New Orleans. Yeah, it's a great quote. If silk patches were first worn to conceal scars and blemishes, by the 18th century they were worn by women as fashionable accessories. However, there's always an exception here in New Orleans, and in 1730, a male chronicler whose memoirs are here at the collection recorded wearing them as part of his Mardi Gras costume in Bayou St. John. He went as a shepherdess. Likewise, the fashion for rouge continued into the Spanish period. Archaeologists frequently find what are often referred to as rouge pots, these kind of multi-purpose ointment cosmetic containers made of French tin-glazed earthenware, what is known as faïence in French. The mahogany table at right might have served as a dressing table. It, again, has that pied de biche profile. Writing in 1803, the colonial prefect, Losat, wrote that New Orleanians, quote, combined an extremely remarkable manner of speech with natural elegance. Luxury and the composition of the toilette resemble those of Paris. However, a lacquered toilet set was an especially luxurious outlay of financial resources, beyond the reach of most in the 1730s and 40s. Translating literally to Chinese varnish, the words used to describe the Coulange toilette in the inventory are difficult to interpret with certainty. If they were indeed export goods from China or Japan, they might have been imported via the French Company of the Indies. Lacquered goods might even have been smuggled via Mexico, as Chinese porcelain is believed to have been in and around Mobile, Alabama. It's also possible that these are just japanned objects, decorated with an imitation lacquer by a European or even a colonial artist. In Paris, the Martin brothers invented a decorative varnish in 1728 that bears their name, and this Parisian lacquer substitute was being exported to and reproduced in what's now Haiti by the 1760s. There is at least one specific reference to Parisian lacquer in Louisiana in the home of the colonial official Denis Nicolas Foucault. Foucault was the Louisiana colony's commissary from 1762 until 1769. Canadian-born, Foucault was found guilty of conspiring to overthrow the Spanish in a Creole rebellion that broke in 1768. His property was confiscated, he was placed under house arrest, many of the other co-conspirators shot by firing squad, and Foucault was finally expelled from Louisiana, sent back to France. The seizure of his property records lacquer objects, including a pair of corner cupboards with Chinese lacquer panels described as new and with marble tops. And this is all 1769. Foucault's bedchamber contained the most extravagant assemblage of goods in the entire house: a dressing table and a toilette of Parisian lacquer, a dressing glass in a lacquer frame, 6 porcelain basins, and glass scent bottles were found on the table, which was draped with an embroidered muslin frame or cover. Arranged over the mirror was a covering of crimson damask trimmed with gold braid, similar perhaps to this table. The actual toilet set included 8 round and square boxes of different sizes, all covered in Parisian lacquer, along with a whisk for dusting powder off of clothing, a brush, a small saucer, and a cup with a gold rim, 4 crystal bottles, and 4 porcelain pomade pots, which completed the set. Both Meissen and Sèvres porcelain were sold in Haiti by the 1760s, and it's entirely possible that Foucault arrived in Louisiana with such luxuries as he arrived from France. This is a portrait from Martinique, a French island still part of France today in the Caribbean, and provides us with a rare view of a French colonial dressing table, complete with lacquer boxes. Also note the cage with the escaped green parrot and the mirror plaqued on into the paneling of the house, of the room. Like the appointment of the room itself, the dressing table reinforced metropolitan standards, including dressing rituals that were as important for men as they were for women. Dressing to impress was far from frivolous. Indeed, it was a necessity. In his letters to relations in France, the soldier turned Louisiana planter Pradel went so far as to write in 1755 that our colony has become opulent. One must do as others so as to avoid ridicule. Stakes were high. And this opulence included social affairs that brought the elite together, with the dining table an important scene for domestic display. Wealthy colonists and Creoles invested a significant part of their wealth in silverware that served as a visual manifestation of prestige while also retaining value as bullion. At the time of her death in 1738, Françoise's mother owned 7 silver place settings, a soup spoon, and 2 tumblers. Françoise again inherited all of this in 1746. Unfortunately, there's little in the way of surviving colonial-era silver from Louisiana. However, the Coulange silver might have resembled that seen here, the work of a French silversmith active in Quebec. The tumbler is an especially common French colonial form. I like to see this as a French colonial mint julep cup. Willing to debate that with anyone interested in probing that further. The stakes of fine dining and entertaining only increased for Françoise after she married her second husband, d'Auberville, a French-born nobleman. D'Auberville served as the colony's highest judge, second only to the governor, which made Françoise the second lady of Louisiana for most of the 1750s, after the governor's wives anyway. In addition to exercising his duties as a royal official, Françoise's second husband was also engaged in transatlantic trade with a cousin, actually a brother-in-law in Nantes, who was also his cousin, sending furs and indigos to France in return for French textiles and wine. His probate inventory from 1757 records the material extent of the couple's domestic luxury, which included 2 lacquer corner cupboards, chintz tapestries, over a dozen paintings, giltwood mirrors, and consoles. In a space identified as the dining room, the table was set with tin-glazed earthenware, porcelain, crystal, and silver. Their silver included over 24 round and oval platters, salad bowls and a mustard pot, cruets, 10 soup spoons, and close to 50 knives. 52 scalloped-edged silver plates and 27 place settings were also inventoried. The armorial silver plate seen here from Canada was actually ordered by one of Françoise's cousins and provides a baseline for the kind of silver available to colonists here in Louisiana, which was a mix of both French and locally produced silver. Also reinforces that this is an interrelated Pan-American group, basically, from Canada to the Caribbean. Thanks. The d'Auberville inventory lists 2 silver surtouts or centerpieces with mirrors that likely reflected the light provided by 6 silver candlesticks. Dishes were served on 12 platters and in 2 soup tureens of tin-glazed earthenware, and food was eaten off of 4 dozen porcelain plates, which might have resembled the plate seen here, taken as booty by a New Englander from the French fortress of Louisbourg and what's now Nova Scotia in 1744. Porcelain plates could be purchased here locally in New Orleans from the likes of Paul Rastou, a merchant who in 1736 received a shipment of 203 blue and white porcelain plates, likely Chinese. This is the first reference I found to the wholesale export of porcelain in Louisiana, rather early on. Like their peers in France, the d'Auberville family drank coffee and tea and probably chocolate. Served from 3 silver and 1 porcelain coffee pots and 3 porcelain teapots, these drinks were poured into porcelain and faïence cups, sweetened with sugar held in 2 silver and 3 porcelain sugar bowls. Of course, none of this was served by itself. In 1746, Françoise inherited the 12 enslaved African men, women, and children listed here. A married woman, a slaveholder at age 14, Françoise was born into a family with long-standing, intimate experience with chattel slavery. In Canada, both her mother and her father's families owned a succession of indigenous slaves beginning in 1711. And as early as 1716, Françoise's maternal grandmother, the daughter of a nail maker from Quebec, owned 2 African slaves on Dauphin Island. Enslaved people constituted an element of visual display for elite and aspiring colonists here in New Orleans. Even in France, Françoise remained surrounded by those that she kept in bondage. She departed for Paris in 1759 with a man named Sozy, a woman also named Françoise, and 2 native girls, possibly companions or attendants for her 2 daughters. And this is a common practice for elites traveling back and forth between the colony and the metropole, with these 2 figures, a girl and a lady from Saint-Domingue, from Haiti. In addition to inheriting actual human property, Françoise received a silver slave collar from her parents, the kind of thing typically worn by a waiting man or a young boy. The Coulange collar might have been simple and smooth, or more elaborately engraved with initials, a cipher, or a crest, even a complete coat of arms, possibly coming equipped with a small padlock. This is an example, an American example from Maryland. Alexandre de Batz provides us with some of the earliest visual records from Louisiana. This 1732 drawing of Choctaw warriors also shows an African boy wearing a presumably silver collar, an earring, and a turban-like hat or cap. The collar likely resembled a rare surviving example, also from 1732, and worn by an enslaved African man in Glasgow, in Scotland. Although the Coulange collar itself does not survive, it is the first such object that I've encountered in the archival record for Louisiana. With or without applied ornament, it would have communicated a potent message to those who saw it around the neck of one of Françoise's slaves, binding the wearer literally and figuratively to her. And what really strikes me in thinking about this object is how it transformed, using silver, a dehumanizing symbol of brute force, into an aesthetic object, which might also be said of the wearer themselves. On an even greater level, the collar's presence amid a collection of family silver in 1740s New Orleans speaks volumes to Louisiana's evolution as a slave society. Consider how in 1801, the house that Françoise was sharing with her children was also home to 31 enslaved people, mostly women and their children and grandchildren. As a high-ranking official, public officer, Mohini stood at the helm of a prominent urban household, and recalling the names of those enslaved by Françoise and her family is the first step in coming to terms with the realities of their daily lives and their possessions. We'll hear more about this image shortly, which is one of my favorites. Wishful thinking on my part, but it's easy to reimagine this as a portrait of the Mohini family. I do want to direct your attention, though, to one particular figure, the widow Mahogany, the aunt of the matriarch in the portrait. A noble woman like Françoise de Coulange, she was also born here in 1732, and both ladies would have known each other, moved in the same social circles. This could just be Françoise in 1800, but it's not. Both women saw New Orleans transform from a rustic French colonial village to a newly urbanized cosmopolitan port. Along with architecture, this included changes and innovations in furnishings. Walnut and cypress might predominate in what we have surviving today with a Louisiana provenance. But mahogany can be documented early on, as early as the 1730s. It was even being milled here in New Orleans in the 1760s. In 1757, Françoise's mahogany furniture included an armoire in which she stored her clothing, but also an English mahogany desk or secretary used by her daughters, and probably a piece of Anglo-colonial manufacture likely smuggled in. And to give a context for this, in Louisbourg, which is that French colonial fortress in Nova Scotia, a French ship was stopped in 1751 carrying English desks in the hold, all of which were confiscated. The last place the ship had been to was Newport, Rhode Island. And so I showed this example, a desk, one of the earliest pieces by John Goddard, which was found in Nova Scotia. Perhaps one of those early desks. I would love that. But these things traveled. French colonial inventories from Canada mention English furniture as early as the 1720s, and Louisiana was no different. Both British and American goods arrived here in greater numbers under the Spanish. An 1802 advertisement from Louisiana's first newspaper announced the sale of pianofortes, billiard tables, and lamps from New York. The Bouligny house already had a proliferation of English mahogany furniture in 1801, including 2 dining tables, another tables, and 2 sets of chairs. The inventory also cites 12 ordinary side chairs of English make painted green. A certain reference to Windsor chairs, exported en masse from places like Newport and Philadelphia, and also made locally by immigrant American makers. Windsor chairs appear in Louisiana paintings by Salazar, with this example corroborating an 1801 remark by New York visitor John Pintard. Some things, however, were less quick to change. Pintard described chimney pieces in New Orleans as highly gilt in 1801. You can imagine such mirrors installed over a Creole mantle, like one seen in the 1794 elevation of a New Orleans home. Pintard's words recall the 4 Trumeau mirrors, with their giltwood frames and landscape paintings, broken in transit before they could be installed in Françoise's home in 1764. In this presentation, I hope to have underscored how aspiring Louisianans like Françoise made use of domestic goods, as well as foreign imports during the colonial era. Reading and seeing these goods can nuance our understanding of Louisiana before Americanization. I never mentioned the chair in the portrait, which is similar to a contemporary Parisian example owned by the last Bishop of New France in Quebec in 1760. The chair is a material embodiment of the stratified rank-conscious culture of representation and display into which Françoise was born. As Pradel wrote in a 1755 letter, "We may be in another world than France, but we like our ease, and we see to our comforts as best we can." Directly across the river from Jackson Square, Pradel's now vanished Montplaisir plantation was furnished with large pier glasses, damask-upholstered furniture, and giltwood consoles with marble tops, all ordered from Paris before 1764. Yet Louisiana was not Paris, and the chair in the portrait also recalls the Louisiana chair that many of you saw at the collection on Friday. This juxtaposition reminds us that colonial Louisiana was a place where ideas, styles, and materials traveled as easily as people. As they settled the colony, these same individuals might assert prestige and reinvent themselves using material goods acquired with the newfound wealth. More than a mere illustration of Louisiana's early diversity, these objects were in fact intimately involved in the shaping of the colony and of Louisiana by people like Françoise Petit de Coulange, born a subject of Louis XV, but who died an American citizen. Living in a part of the South before it was the South, Françoise and her material world prompt us to reconsider traditional narratives of colonialism, regionalism, and identity in an early America that was truly vast and in more ways than one. Thank you very much.